We're going to talk about the single deadliest accident in the entire history of aviation. It's a tragedy that was born from a perfect storm of thick fog, human error, and just a bizarre chain of events that would end up completely reshaping air travel safety as we know it.
Okay, so picture this. The date is March 27, 1977. On a runway completely swallowed by this thick, rolling fog, a fully loaded Boeing 747 is pushing its thrust levers all the way forward. This massive jumbo jet starts hurtling down the runway, its headlights just barely cutting through the haze, picking up speed for takeoff. It's a totally routine procedure, except for one single, catastrophic detail that they just can't see yet.
Because roaring toward them, somewhere in that same dense fog, was another Boeing 747. The result was, and still is, the deadliest accident the industry has ever seen. So, the big question is, how on earth did something so unthinkable even happen?
To really get our heads around this, we first need to look at the two planes involved. Their fates were pretty much sealed by a whole series of really unfortunate events.
So on one side, you have KLM Flight 4085. It's a charter flight coming in from Amsterdam. And on the other, there's Pan Am Flight 1736, also a charter that started its journey in Los Angeles and then picked up more folks in New York. Both of these jets were absolutely packed with people who were all heading for a sunny holiday cruise, and they were both supposed to land at the exact same place, Las Palmas Airport in the Canary Islands.
But here's the thing. They never made it to Las Palmas. And to understand why they both ended up on that foggy runway in Tenerife, we actually have to rewind the clock a few hours.
It all started with a political event, of all things. A local independence group called in a bomb threat to the main airport at Las Palmas, and not long after that, a small device actually went off in the terminal. Now, the damage was really minor, but of course, authorities weren't taking any chances. They shut the entire airport down, and that forced all the incoming planes, including our two 747s, to divert to a tiny airport on the nearby island of Tenerife. And right here, this is where the problems really start to stack up. See, Los Rodeos was a small regional airport. It was never designed to handle jumbo jets, let alone a whole fleet of them that were now being rerouted there. It had just one runway and one main taxiway. And, what would turn out to be the most critical factor, its location high up in the mountains meant it was famous for sudden, incredibly dense fog that could just roll in from the ocean with almost no warning.
So you can see what's happening. On the ground at this tiny, crowded airport, a series of what seemed like small decisions and unlucky circumstances all started to lock into place one after another, creating a situation that would soon become completely inescapable. Let's just walk through this chain of events because it's wild. First, the airport is a zoo, totally overcrowded. The KLM captain, trying to be efficient and save time later, decides to top off his fuel tanks right there on the tarmac. This was a huge decision, because his massive 747 was now completely blocking the only taxiway, and right as the refueling is finishing up, that infamous fog descends, just like that, cutting visibility down to almost nothing. So now, with the taxiway blocked, air traffic control has only one choice: tell both the KLM and the Pan Am jets to use the active runway itself as a taxiway to get into position.
This maneuver is called a back taxi. It is definitely not standard procedure, and it's incredibly risky. What it meant was that you now had two 747s on the exact same strip of pavement, totally invisible to each other, and crucially, invisible to the control tower. The only thing connecting them was the radio.
And that brings us to the final and most fatal piece of the puzzle, a total breakdown in communication. In these last critical moments, everyone, both cockpits and the control tower, was operating completely and utterly blind.
Okay, so the KLM jet gets to the end of the runway, does a 180-degree turn, and lines up, ready to go. The captain, he's anxious to get in the air, so he radios the tower, but he uses this really ambiguous phrase. He says, "We are now at takeoff." Think about that. It wasn't a request, it was a statement.
The air traffic controller hears this and replies with, "Okay," but he immediately follows it up with a crystal clear, impossible to misunderstand instruction. "Stand by for takeoff, I will call you." He had not given them clearance. They were supposed to wait. Now this is where it all goes wrong. At the exact same microsecond that the controller is telling KLM to wait, the Pan Am crew, who also heard the KLM captain, keys their own mic to shout a warning to everyone. "We are still taxiing down the runway."
So what happens when two people transmit on the same radio frequency at the same time? They cancel each other out. In the KLM cockpit, those two absolutely critical messages, the controller saying stand by and the Pan Am crew saying we're still here, were basically erased and replaced by a loud, piercing, high-pitched squeal.
So just try to imagine you're sitting in that KLM cockpit for a second. All you hear is the controller's initial OK, followed by just garbage noise. You completely miss the most important part of the entire transmission, stand by. So the captain hears OK and interprets it as, OK, you're cleared for takeoff.
There was one last chance to stop this. The KLM flight engineer, maybe he heard a tiny piece of the Pan Am message through the static. He leans over and he asks his captain directly, is he not clear then, the Pan American? But the captain, he was one of the most senior, respected pilots of the airline. He was confident. He just replied, oh yes, and he pushed the throttles all the way forward. Through the fog, the Pan Am crew suddenly saw landing lights lunging toward them. They tried desperately to swerve the massive jet off the runway, but it was just too late. The collision that followed was so horrific that it forced the entire aviation industry to take a hard look in the mirror and change its ways forever.
The human cost was just staggering. 583 people lost their lives. It remains, to this day, the deadliest accident in the history of aviation.
When you look at the numbers, it's just devastating. On the KLM flight, which was full of jet fuel from that recent refueling and just instantly burst into a fireball, all 248 people on board died. But on the Pan Am flight, the impact actually ripped the fuselage open, and almost miraculously, 61 people, including the pilots, managed to crawl out of the wreckage and survive.
The official investigation, as you might guess, put the primary blame on the KLM captain for taking off without clearance. But they also pointed to this long list of other things that contributed: the thick fog, the radio interference, the use of confusing, non-standard language, and a really dangerous cockpit dynamic that we now call captainitis. That's where junior crew members are basically too intimidated to challenge a senior pilot, even when they know something is seriously wrong.
But here's the positive legacy, if you can call it that. Tenerife sparked a revolution in air safety. Aviation language became strictly standardized. For example, the word takeoff is now sacred. It is only used for the actual clearance and nothing else. The whole concept of crew resource management, or CRM, was born from this. It's training that teaches flight crews to work as a team, and it empowers anyone in that cockpit to speak up. And of course, airports now have to have ground radar, so controllers can see planes on the ground no matter what the weather is like.
These changes made flying fundamentally safer for every single one of us. And yet, this disaster is still this incredibly powerful reminder of how a few small, unlucky events, when you combine them with the messiness of human communication, can spiral into an absolute catastrophe. And it really leaves us with a question, doesn't it? Even with all our amazing modern technology, how do we make absolutely sure that the lessons learned on that foggy runway are never, ever forgotten?